Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, I'm going to profile the 6 Samurai deck that I used to top my very first YCS all the way back in February of 2011 at YCS Dallas. Now, from a historical importance perspective, this deck doesn't really hit the marks that some of the other decks have. It's certainly not as influential as T-Hero, certainly not as influential as Teledad. As a matter of fact, the deck that I'm about to profile was only really playable for one single YCS. It just so happens to be the first YCS that I ever topped, and today just happens to be the exact 10-year anniversary to the day. So I thought there's no better way to commemorate that day than to profile this deck. What changed between this event and going forward is that the cards that you see here, Gateway of the Six, was at 3 for YCS Dallas, and then would subsequently be limited to 1. And the deck was actually still playable at 1. It won the first YCS of the upcoming format. But in the grand scheme of things, this deck was at its absolute peak power at YCS Dallas in 2011. For historical context, we're talking about a format where prior, Gravekeepers just won the last YCS. Gravekeepers Recruiter was a new release. Sean McCabe, Fraser Smith made it to the finals with a variant of Gravekeepers. Fraser Smith won the event prior to this with Gravekeepers. Other top decks at the time, you could anticipate facing decks like X-Sabers. You could anticipate facing decks like Blackwing. So we're really talking about an old school style of Yu-Gi-Oh! Gladiator Beasts was still somewhat playable. You can anticipate playing against potentially some anti-meta variants. So those were some of the top decks at the time. And then, of course, the boogeyman in the room at YCS Dallas was 6 Samurai. People were frantically looking for puppet plants and kinetic soldiers. I mean, we're talking about some side deck options that were very, very anti-warrior. So I'm going to profile the variant that I ran, and there's actually an interesting backstory about some of the card choices that I made. I ended up running the red and blue infinite combo, and when I hopped onto that plane, head down to Dallas, I had no anticipation whatsoever, no thought in my mind of running the red and blue variant. It wasn't until I watched none other than Billy Break the night before the event, and really even that Thursday before the event, running his variant with red and blue in the hotel lobby, that I saw what it could do. I saw the combos that I didn't realize occurred or that didn't realize worked, that I decided to jump off of the Hand of the 6 Samurai variant, which was the predominant version, and embrace this red and blue variant. It was obviously, in retrospect, a great decision. I'm not sure if I would have topped with the Hand of the 6 Samurai variant. I ended up infinite comboing 4 times in 11 rounds in game 1 alone. So it really, in retrospect, could have been a decision that entirely got me my first YCS top. I'll never know for sure, but having access to an infinite combo with infinite attack, infinite searches, infinite anything you wanted with Gateway and the red and blue combo, in retrospect, was a really great decision. I'll even tell you a little bit more about that story when I get to the deck profile. But without further ado, enjoy the 10-year anniversary deck profile of the legendary 6 Samurai deck from YCS Dallas in 2011. Okay, we'll start the deck profile with the deck's namesake. This is the red and blue variant of the 6 Samurai in order to infinite combo with a copy of Gateway and then another continuous spell card. You needed 2 copies of Mizuho and 1 copy of Shinai. I'll talk a little bit about what these cards enabled once we get to the end of the deck profile. From that point on, you had the 3 copies of Kageki and 3 copies of Kagamusha. This allowed you to summon Shien as fast as possible on the opening turn. We also ran 3 copies of Kazan and then a single copy of Grandmaster of the 6 Samurai. The Kazans and the Grandmaster allowed you to add counters to your Gateway or 6 Samurai United. Also, it allowed you to have a little bit of variation in terms of what levels you could synchro into. Kazan gave you access to level 6s like Barkion and Bryanak. Grandmaster gave you access to cards like Black Rose Dragon, and Gateway allows you to add from the graveyard, so only 1 copy of Grandmaster was sufficient in order to have access to those plays. Kazan also allowed you to go Kageki, Kagamusha, Kazan into a level 9. Trishula was not out at the time, but Mistrom was, which was actually a pretty good card in the mirror match, so Mistrom was a really good level 9 that you could go into. I'll talk a little bit more about the monster lineup in a little bit, particularly the red and blue engine and how it worked. Then for the spells, at this point in time, we had 3 copies of Book of Moon. Book of Moon was limited to 1 at the end of this format, but at this point, Book of Moon played a great and important role. It did 2 things. If you went first, you could set it, and when your opponent summoned Kageki, you could activate Book of Moon and flip it face down, so that the Kagamusha that they brought out came out in defense mode without the ability to synchro into a Shien. That was obviously really good. If you went second, you could Book of Moon, or at least target their Shien with Book of Moon, and then they would usually negate unless they had something like Solemn Judgment or another Kagamusha on the field, that would be really unfortunate. But in either case, you'd Book of Moon and it would force a negation, and then it would allow you to hopefully play. It depends how many traps they have, but it could potentially allow you to play through your opponent's turn 1 Shien. We had 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. This was a little bit before Pat Hoban made it super popular to run 3 copies, but when this deck gets its full combo, it can do literally infinite damage. So the 1,000 life points absolutely didn't matter, and you wanted to get turn 1 Shien as fast as possible. Which is why, of course, we ran 3 copies of Shien Smoke Signal, and then the single copy of Reinforcements of the Army. The continuous Spell of Trap cards that made it really frustrating to play against this deck. You always kind of held your breath and hoped your opponent didn't open any of these, but during this format, with so many of them, they often did. 3 copies of Gateway of the Six, and 3 copies of Six Samurai United. Gateway, thankfully, was limited to 1 at the end of this format, which didn't limit it quite well enough, actually, because it actually won the first YCS after it was limited to 1. So, nevertheless, Gateway of the Six. I'll talk a little bit about why Gateway of the Six was so powerful with the red and blue engine just a little bit. To round up the Spell and Trap card lineup, we have some borderline staple-ish cards. We had double MST, which was really good in the mirror match. Hitting the continuous Spell and Trap cards was important. A Trunade and a Monster Reborn. Giant Trunade was legal in this format, then it was legal during the summer format at the end of this format. It was eventually banned by the end of the 2011 year, heading into September, right before the Plant Tengu deck got really popular. At least the second iteration of Plant Tengu got popular in the hands of Billy Brake, but this was the second to last format for Giant Trunade. For the trap lineup, this was the last time we could run, at least up until modern day, 3 copies of Solemn Warning. Warning was incredibly powerful in the mirror match. You could activate this in response to your opponent's normal summon of Kageki and stop them from getting any counters. There were also times you'd want to use this in response to Kageki's effect. But 3 copies of Solemn Warning. From that point on, we had some other counter traps. We had Solemn Judgment, which was limited to 1. When we're playing so many cards like Shien, Naturia Barkion, having cards like Solemn Judgment are incredible. And then Musakana Magatami, I think I'm pronouncing this card right. A singleton copy. It had some interesting applications. It allows you to negate a card when it destroys a 6 Samurai, when you control a 6 Samurai. So it can stop some counter traps. It can stop some of the cards that break your boards. It was pretty good. Then a single copy of Double-Edged Sword Technique. This was run in multiples by a lot of players at the event. This seemed a little bit more like a win more card. And what I mean by that is I'd rather my cards, at least at this time, either set my board up or protect my board. Double-Edged Sword Technique was a rebound card, a card that allowed you to come back, and this deck didn't really have a problem of needing to ever really come back, quite frankly. You often, once you established a board, if you could protect it with the counter traps, you would just win, or just infinite combo them. So I sided this card out a lot. And then 1 copy of Mirror Force. In retrospect, I probably wouldn't run this. It was okay because if your opponent used Shien earlier in the turn, or you could Book of Moon Shien and then chain Mirror Force. There were ways of getting Mirror Force to resolve, but it, in and of itself, is probably a inferior choice. I'll go into the extra deck, and then I'll talk about the infinite combo before I talk about the side deck. So I do not have a copy of Barkion. I looked all around. I cannot find my old dual terminal Naturia Barkion. So this is a Naturia Barkion, not Naturia Beast. I did not run Naturia Beast at YCS Dallas. So I'm going to put it face down. This is a Naturia Barkion, the level 6 that allows you to banish from your graveyard to negate a trap card. The other ones, though, that I ran was a Colossal Fighter for a level 8, in addition to Scrap Dragon and Stardust Dragon. For level 6s, there was a Goyo Guardian, who was soon banned after this, and a Bryanak. Level 7s, we had Black Rose Dragon and Scrap Archfiend of all things. Again, we could go into level 7s with Grandmaster and Kagamusha. Of the big ones, the level 9s, we had a Mistworm and a Ally of Justice Decisive Armor. I could definitely probably have, in retrospect, cut Decisive Armor. There weren't a ton of light monsters that your opponent could go into at the time, but nevertheless, a Decisive Armor. For the level 5s, which is arguably the most important one, because Kagamusha plus Kageki is level 5, I had an Android, probably for time, a Cataster, and then I only have 1 copy of Shien, but 3 copies of Legendary 6 Samurai Shien, which honestly, 99% of the time, this is the one you went into. Very occasionally, you'd go into Bryanak or Mistworm to try and bait out, or to try and bounce your opponent's Shien after you forced the negation, but for the most part, it was a Shien deck. Sometimes Barkion too. Barkion had some applications. Before I go any further, I kind of alluded to a few times the infinite combo. So, fun story about this. Most people going into this event believed that you needed 2 copies of Shanai to do this combo, or 2 copies of Gateway to do this combo, which made it so that many people thought this combo was inconsistent. You know, if you had double Gateway, you should win anyway. Well, heading into the event, and you have to understand something. At this point, I had never topped the YCS before. So heading into the event, in the hotel lobby on the Friday night before, I watched Billy Brake run this variant of the deck. This is before I ever really met Billy Brake. You know, 2 years later, he'd be staying in my basement for YCS Providence. But at this point, he didn't know who I was. But I watched him run this deck, and I watched him do the combo with just 6 Samurai United and just Gateway of the 6th. And I'll show you what that combo is. All right, so for this combo to work, you needed 1 Gateway of the 6 and then another continuous spell. It could be another copy of Gateway. That would obviously work. Or it could be 6 Samurai United. Honestly, most people thought you needed double Gateway for this combo to work. The fact that it would work with just 1 Gateway and United made it so this deck was way more potent than I think people realized and gave it credit for. There were actually times where I was doing this combo and people were like, wait a minute, I thought you went neutral. I didn't realize you actually gained counters with these 2 continuous. Then you needed 1 copy of either red or blue. And from that point, you needed the ability to special summon another 6 Samurai. So you had 1 Grandmaster, 3 Kazan, and 3 Kageki. Technically, it worked with red and blue, just like this. So if you opened with both of these, that would also work. This might seem like it's a 4-card, 5-card combo, and what are the odds of actually pulling this off? But you have to understand that so much of this deck searches, and you don't necessarily need to do this on the first turn. You could sort of just out of the blue infinite combo somebody. So that's something to consider. I'm going to do the combo, let's say, with blue and Kageki. So you open Gateway, United, blue, and Kageki. So you start with summoning Kageki, and you use the effect, and you summon the blue boy. Well, that puts 2 counters on 6 Samurai United and 4 counters on Gateway of the 6th. From that point, I'm going to use Gateway of the 6th to take 1 off of here and 3 off of here so that it's at 1 and 1. And I'm going to search the red. Then I'll special summon red. This goes to 2. This goes to 3. Then I'll use 1 off of here and all of them off of here to search for the other copy of red. This is all you need to do the combo. 2 reds and 1 blue. From that point, I will special summon my red, bringing this to 2, and bringing this to 2. Then I'll use Mizuho's effect, and I'll tribute off the Shanai. And with Mizuho's effect, I will destroy the other Mizuho on my board. So now these both go to the graveyard. Shanai's effect activates, and it adds Mizuho from the graveyard back to my hand. So now the current state is, let's say here is my deck, and here is my graveyard. I have Mizuho in hand and 2 and 2. From that point on, I can take all of the counters off of my gateways and add Shanai from the graveyard back to my hand. And then I can immediately special summon it. So this goes to 2, and now this goes to 1. Then I can special summon another Mizuho. This goes to 2. This goes to 4. Then I can do the exact same thing that I did before. Now, this Mizuho has already used its effect, so I'll have to use this Mizuho to tribute the Shanai to destroy the Mizuho who's already used its effect. That will go to the graveyard. The effects now activate. Shanai allows me to add Mizuho back to my hand. From this point on, I have 2 and 4, so I can take 1 off of here and 3 off of here and add Shanai to the graveyard back to my hand. And then I can special summon. This goes to 2. This goes to 3. Technically, I actually should be going down to 0 on this. I'm kind of getting silly here by doing increments of 1, but the point here is if I continue this loop that I've just demonstrated, it adds 1 counter to this every single time, which means at the end of this, you'd have infinite counters on the Gateway of the 6th, and technically 2 on the 6 Samurai United. Once you had infinite counters, then you could search your deck for literally every single 6 Samurai. So you would have every single 6 Samurai in your whole deck in your hand. And if you chose to do so, you technically could draw 2 cards now with a deck that has no more monsters in it, which would be pretty good. You would likely have to discard a bunch of cards during the end phase, but again, Gateway allows you to add them all back. In addition to that, you can end the board with 5 monsters if you need. Plus, on the following turn, all 5 of those monsters are going to have infinite attack. So this was actually more ideal if you went second, or at least had the ability to attack. Technically, you're not going to end the game, or rather the turn, with any negations, which could be a problem. But for the most part, infinite attack, infinite searches, ending with 6 cards in hand, 2 draws from a deck that has no monsters in it. So I'm just going to shuffle this up. There are quite a few dead draws. Gateway's now a dead draw. All the searchers, like Smoke Signal's a dead draw, but Torrential's pretty good. MSD's not that bad either. So, I mean, we're drawing in a deck now that has absolutely no monsters in it whatsoever because we searched all of them with Gateway of the 6. So you typically ended turn 1. And by the way, I would go for this turn 1. That's a question I sometimes get asked. If I open this, I'm ending my turn with 6 cards in hand, double draws off the United, and the ability to add them all back on the following turn. You're going to have to break a board with 5 monsters, and you're going to have to get rid of the 6 Samurai, the Gateway of the 6, or else I'm going infinite again on the next turn. So yes, I would do that. I would, in fact, go for it like that, pass my turn with 5 monsters, primarily in defense mode, with 6 cards in hand with all of my 6 Samurais in the graveyard. I would, in fact, do that. But in terms of top decks at the time, there was obviously the mirror match. If you played at YCS Dallas, you could have anticipated a lot of mirror matches. From that point on, one of the common decks that you could use to counter this was Frog Monarchs. Partially because the deck had access to Puppet Plant, which was a monster you could discard to take control of Shien, and then if you had a Monarch or Vanity's Empty or Vanity's Fiend or a Light and Darkness Dragon, you could just tribute it off the board immediately, and you would never have to worry about it negating your spell and traps. But we had Frog Monarchs, we had 6 Samurai. Some people thought Black Wings was a decent deck choice. I don't necessarily agree with that, but some people thought Black Wings was good. If you went first with Black Wings, Icarus was kind of a problem because you could destroy the counter, or the counters if they had them face down. You could destroy the continuous spell of trap cards. If your opponent went Gateway, Kageki, activate Kageki effect, you could go Icarus, kill Kageki and the Gateway, and now they're summoning Kagemusha in defense mode. And if you have Shura with plus Kalut, you would just totally win that game. So there were a few issues there if your opponent got to play Icarus on turn 1, but other than that, I didn't think that deck was much of a problem. Another deck that was interesting was Gravekeepers. Fraser Smith had recently won with the Gravekeeper variant that became incredibly popular for a brief period of time during this format and then picked up again during the summer. Gravekeepers didn't really have a great matchup against the triple Gateway version of 6 Samurai, so it wasn't a super popular deck, but it had won a recent event. Actually made it to the finals for both players, Fraser Smith and Sean McCabe, so you could have easily encountered Gravekeepers at YCS Dallas. It was definitely something to look out for. One of the main reasons this deck lost a little bit of popularity is that Royal Tribute's not that great against this deck. There's almost an equal number of monsters in the 6 Samurai decks as in the Gravekeeper decks, so running a Royal Tribute-based deck didn't make as much sense. Then you had X-Sabers. X-Sabers was one of my losses at this event. I actually lost to Sam Pedigo. Sam Pedigo topped his first YCS at Dallas as well. I lost to him the last round of day 1. I actually played Fraser Smith in this event too, who was running not Gravekeepers, but 6 Samurais. It's funny, this event I met Fraser Smith, who would later become a teammate on ARG, and Sam Pedigo, who would later become a teammate on ARG. So kind of a funny event in that sense. But these were some of the top decks you can anticipate, and then there were just sort of some anti-meta decks. I'm going to put a skill drain here just to point out that there was a Fossil Dyna anti-meta deck at the top. Not a skill drain deck, but a Fossil Dyna variant, so you could have conceivably ran into an anti-meta deck as well. But these are some of the top decks at the time. In terms of what I sided, I'll show you what I sided, and then I'll talk about what I think was a good idea. I sided 2 copies of Kinetic Soldier. I have 1 here, but I sided 2 copies of Kinetic. Kinetic was really good. In the mirror match, if you set this, your opponent basically had to go into their extra deck to kill it, because with 1800 defense, plus the boost that it received when it battled a warrior, there was very little that they could do unless they had Hand of the 6 Samurai, or in this deck, Mizuho. It could really slow down the mirror match, so I definitely think the double Kinetic was a good choice. I sided 2 copies of Max C. You have to understand that this was at a time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where we had hand traps like Max C, but they weren't necessarily staple at this point. I did in fact side them. Maybe I should have mained them. I mean, in retrospect, I topped, but maybe if I mained them, I wouldn't have lost in the top 32 in a mirror match to Nazar, who ended up winning the event. I sided 2 copies of Snowman Eater. Technically, Shien can protect against Snowman Eater, and if your opponent knows that you're setting this, they might not attack into it, because if you're setting a monster in the mirror match, it's probably Kinetic or Snowman Eater. And if you can't protect your Shien, you're not going to attack into this. But it was a decent way of slowing down in the mirror match. I cited the single copy of Dark Hole. I liked this against Blackwings at the time, because as I alluded to earlier, Icarus could be annoying. If they Icarused your first turn play on the Kageki and your continuous, you would likely leave you stranded. So if you Dark Hold the Blackwing off the board, now they can't Icarus you when you start to go off. So that single copy of Dark Hole was there for that. That's also another reason why I ran a Forbidden Lance. This was specifically for Blackwings. You could, again, protect your Kageki from Icarus attack, and then they might still pop your back row, specifically your continuous spells, but you would then be able to at least summon your Shien. So that was what that was for. I was so afraid of Blackwings, as you can see. I even cited 2 copies of Starlight Road. That's partially one of the reasons why Stardust Dragon, although somewhat of an inferior extra deck monster relative to the time period, was in the extra deck. So double Starlight Road made it so that if I went first against Blackwings, I could obviously set this and then activate it and stop their Icarus attack. So in a format without Heavy Storm, I cited 2 copies of Starlight Road. I did play Blackwings at this event, and I had a pretty good Blackwing matchup because I think this deck was superior to Blackwings, but I cited, as you can see, a ton for Blackwings. Then I had 2 copies of Chain Disappearance. The idea behind these was going first against 6 Samurais, you could Chain Disappearance the Kageki or Kagamusha and make it so that they would lose access to Shien for the game. I think it was an okay game plan, but I didn't draw it that often. I do not recall drawing it that often. I was afraid of it, that's for sure, playing against it, but going first, I didn't open it. 2 copies of Rivalry of Warlords. This deck, being an all-warrior deck, could access Rivalry of Warlords. This was one of the best ways of stopping the Monarch deck. If you locked them out with a Rivalry of Warlords, it made it really difficult for them to come back because all of the different Monarchs would have different types, and if they had one Monarch on the board, they couldn't tribute for another. If they took your Shien and you flipped Rivalry in response to the Puppet plan, well, now the Shien's probably going to come back to you because they can't tribute it. Unless they tribute set, technically they could do that. You might not get the Shien back, but bare minimum, it's slowing them down. Then the last card I cited was a copy of Torrential Tribute, which was really good going first against 6 Samurai. If you yourself did not open the combos, you could use Torrential Tribute. And what's actually cool about understanding the mirror match at this time, you could almost always guarantee that you or your opponent were going to open some of the continuous spells, and these add counters even if your opponent summons the 6 Samurai. So it's actually not inconceivable in the mirror match. You go Gateway, United, set Torrential, go. I'm not even going to play any 6 Samurais. Maybe you didn't open them. They play Kageki Kagamusha, you flip Torrential, and now if they don't destroy these, which again, Heavy Storm is banned, they would have to Trunade them or Typhoon them at this point. Now you get a free search, or 2 draws, you get to start comboing off yourself. And honestly, with this deck, if I get to end like that, I'm probably going to OTKU. Because if I have 4 and 2, well, I'm removing 4, I'm removing 2 and 2, and I'm searching red. And then I'm summoning red, and that puts me up to 4 and 1. I'm banishing 4 off of this, and I'm summoning blue, and I'm OTKing you. I'm going infinite counter. So that was actually a very real possibility with Torrential in this deck, because if you opened up continuous spells, you could just activate them and pass.